Thank you. We're going to go ahead and start our budget meeting here in just a minute. We have a quorum now, so I'm waiting for Mr. Modica. I think will be here soon, since he's doing the presentation. Is someone on Mr. Modica's team getting him? Okay, there we go. Perfect. Let's go ahead and call our budget meeting to order. If I can please have a roll call.
Councilwoman Zendejas.
Present.
Councilwoman Allen.
Present.
Councilwoman Price. Councilman Cipriano.
Here.
Councilwoman Mungo. Councilwoman Sorrow.
Present.
Councilmember Uranga.
Present.
Councilman Austin.
Here.
Vice Mayor Richardson. Mayor Garcia.
And I'm here. Thank you very much. We are going to go ahead and go right into our agenda. Want to read the first item, please?
Recommendation to receive and file a presentation on the city's FY23 budget approach.
Mr. Modica.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. So we're happy to be here today to give kind of an overview of our fiscal situation. I know we just adopted the budget a couple months ago, but we have been regularly in the last couple years coming in December to give a sense of the work we're going to be doing in the next year. We then will come back again in March with an update to the council on really, what the actual numbers and the approach is going to be. But tonight is a chance to have you hear our approach and give us some thoughts if we need to modify it at all. I want to start by talking a little bit about our accomplishments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Grace and Kevin Riper. So it's been an amazing year in FY21 and FY22. We were, of course, an early leader in COVID-19 vaccine distribution. The numbers now are over 330,000 residents have been vaccinated. We continue to have an incredibly robust testing program. 662,000 people have been tested, over 1.1 million tests administered in total. Our booster program is underway. We have 16,000 booster shots administered. We're continuing to implement a number of programs to support our residents that were funded by CARES, and now we're transitioning into LBRA and supporting basic needs, early childhood education and supports, youth development, food access, nonprofits, our businesses, our residents, etc. We've launched a number of hotlines and support networks and systems so that people can call us and get connected to services, including BizCare Hotline, BizCare Pop-ups, BizCare Outreach. We have our emergency rental assistance program, which is assisting over 4,000 tenants and landlords with past due rent and utility payments. We've got our open streets. We've got our parklets. We've adopted the Long Beach Recovery Act, which is nearly $250 million program, the size of an entire budget for some cities, and are working through implementation right now. And we've safely reopened City Hall and city facilities following the closures. We are still in the longest coordinated disaster response in the city's history. The EOC was activated in March 2020, and those emergency efforts have continued through today. We've assisted also in other efforts, humanitarian family reunification efforts. We were one of the several emergency shelters set up around the country. We were one of the best, in my opinion, and was really highlighted as a leader, and supported 1,583 migrant children who were reunited with their family members or their sponsors. And the community came out and supported that as well, raising $100,000 to enhance the experience while they were with us in our care. We continued progress on a number of different homelessness efforts. We opened our first year-round shelter that's up and running and serving 125 people. We've bought homes through hotels, a 102-room hotel for transitional support housing, as well as Project Room Key and supporting the Days Inn through 47 additional rooms, and really have made huge progress in getting housing for those that need housing. And finally, we could go on and on about accomplishments, but to sum up the last kind of page is we've continued our implementation of our Racial Equity and Reconciliation Initiative. We've done Racial Equity 101 trainings. We've created action plans, development of tools, and a report on the one-year progress is coming to you soon. Our language access program has really expanded. We've managed a more than 500% increase in translation requests and to make sure that our community can get access to information in the language they feel most comfortable in. We've created new and re-envisioned programs through our parks, including the 4th Street Senior Center and Bixby, Drake, El Dorado, Rancho Los Cerritos, MacArthur, Houghton, and Cherry. We've loaned almost 800,000 digital and physical items from our libraries. We've transitioned to giving out Chromebooks and hotspots as our new Tech2Go service. We've conducted 860 homeless encampment cleanups, collected 2,400 tons of litter through our clean team and illegally dumped items, addressed 1.5 million square feet of graffiti, filled 25,000 potholes, and we also updated and relaunched the Go Long Beach app. We have so many accomplishments that this mayor and city council have helped lead on policy initiatives. Our staff have implemented, and our workforce out there every day has really been amazing at serving our community's needs. So at this point, I'd like to then transition over to Grace, I believe, who will walk through a little bit of how the pandemic has changed our roadmap a little bit, and then you'll hear from Kevin Riper, our finance director, as well. Grace.
Great. Thank you, Tom. As Tom mentioned, this study session is to provide you with an overview of what to expect with the FY23 budget process. We'll be talking about where we are at with the FY23 budget projections, our plans to engage in early community engagement, and next steps in our timeline. Before we discuss the general fund projection status, I wanted to take a moment to remind us of all of the unexpected and unprecedented events that have occurred over the past couple years and how that has impacted our budget development processes and where we are at today. I also want to remind Council how there are overlapping analyses across fiscal years that impact how projections are made. So back in February of 2020, which was during our fiscal 20 year, we were reporting on the ending of FY19. And at that time, FY19 ended with a strong revenue performance. And we were optimistic at that time that FY20 would also perform better than what we had budgeted for FY20. And then the pandemic hit in full force, and the stay-at-home orders were issued in March of 2020. We did not have the data at this time, as there's a lag in when we get economic information, but during this time, the country was experiencing a very swift and very deep recession. What we now know is that this recession was also very short, but we will be discussing that in later slides. At that time, with everything going on, the FY21 budget development process was paused. And then in June, we resumed the FY21 budget development process and implemented a modified and truncated process based on estimates with a modified budget book in order to meet charter deadlines. This FY21 budget included revenue estimates projected to be adversely impacted by the pandemic and utilized one time, such as furloughs and reserves, to balance the budget plan. Then, in February 2021, we came to Council with our FY20 year-end performance report, with the general fund ending with a $20 million shortfall. We ultimately needed to use our operating and emergency reserves to cover the shortfall, which was the first time we had to utilize these reserves in recent history. And then finally, most recently, as we were in the process of developing our FY22 budget, we were able to adopt the Long Beach Recovery Act, made possible by federal and state funds, that has provided us one-time funds to cover any shortfall in FY21, as well as FY22, in order to have a budget that did not have to make service reductions. So this brings us to where we are at today. We have just started our FY22 fiscal year, and we are currently working on closing the books and working through year-end transactions for FY21. We will be bringing back a report on how we performed in FY21 in February. With this information on how FY21 did, we will have a better sense of how FY22 might do, and subsequently FY23. And we will be reporting to City Council in March with a new and updated projection for FY23. So as you can see, there's always some lag in the data that we have available to us and the projections we can make that are a couple years out. So the rest of this presentation will talk about some of the trends we are seeing as we are currently analyzing FY21 year end and what that might mean for the FY23 budget process. As a reminder, the latest projection we had for FY23 was $36 million shortfall, as reported in the proposed FY22 budget book. This was a projection that was largely developed in March of 2021 during the budget development process. And so the next projection update, like I mentioned, will be this March 2022. To get us to this projection update, in January, we'll be starting our 23 base budget process, which provides a baseline of revenue and expenditure updates prior to any changes in services. So for example, during this time, we'll update our records for any negotiated cost increases, overhead rates to be applied, such as pension costs, etc. And also, as I mentioned in the slide before, by this time, we'll also know how FY21 ended, and that information will be used to help inform our March FY23 projection update. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Riper.
Thank you, Grace. For the general fund, the overall revenue trends are definitely improving. Revenue is doing, on aggregate, much better than anybody could have thought at the beginning of the year when the last set of projections were made. General fund revenue is doing particularly well in the two largest categories, and then those revenue categories in the general fund that are declining are some of our smaller categories. So on net, general fund is doing much better. The two dominant categories of revenue in the general fund are, of course, property tax and sales tax. And property tax is doing better than expected because more homes are being sold by high-end homeowners. And as everybody knows, housing prices are going up throughout the country, and especially in California, and especially Southern California. So that turnover, those sales of high-end homes are coming at higher home prices. And of course, under Proposition 13, the assessed value changes to the sale price after the sale is made. So as a result of that property revaluation upward, the taxable value, property tax is doing very well. Sales tax is similarly doing well for a completely different set of reasons. Mostly it's the overall economic recovery in the nation and the state and the region. And that's true for the city's general fund revenue and sales tax, even though it's obvious that the recovery, especially regionally, is very uneven. It is not, the economic recovery is not affecting all socioeconomic strata the same way. An example of that came Friday. On Friday, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the national unemployment rate is down to 4.3%. But BLS also reported that the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim metropolitan area has an unemployment rate of 7.1% in November. That's the highest unemployment rate of any major metro area in the United States, and there's 51 of them. And the week before that, a week ago Friday, the California Economic Development Department reported that the city of Long Beach itself has an even higher unemployment rate than the 7.1% for our area. EDD said Long Beach's unemployment rate in October was 8.5%. So it's clear the economic recovery is not even and not affecting everyone the same way. That said, sales tax revenue comes from all layers, all economic strata of the region. And what's happening is consumers are spending money on taxable goods, and they're spending it in historic amounts and historic proportions. And the reason for that, of course, is those who have jobs have more discretionary income, plus there was federal stimulus money over the last year, And people have to spend, if they want to spend, they have to spend on goods because so many services, which are not taxed, were not available during the pandemic. Goods, which are subject to sales tax, were available. So people shifted, consumers shifted their spending from a more even mix of goods and services to more heavily on goods. And as a result, sales tax, both our Bradley Burns 1% sales tax for the general fund and the Measure A, transactions and use tax, are doing much better than they were predicted to do almost a year ago. Next slide. So that's the revenue picture. And speaking of revenue, I want to take this opportunity to preview a recommended adjustment to the revenue estimation policy that's been in place in the Council's financial and budgetary policies for quite some years. Current financial policy number 10 says, revenues will be projected using a methodology that is reasonably conservative. And staff proposes, effective with the FY23 budget, staff proposes that next summer, when you would consider and adopt the FY23 budget, that policy be changed in one word, but it's an important word, that revenues be projected using a methodology that is reasonably expected. And the reason for this is to try and take advantage of what's a relatively diverse general fund revenue pie for the city. As I showed on the previous slide, while we're doing very well on sales tax and on property tax, and also on cannabis business license tax and permit revenues, some of the categories that aren't doing so well are transient occupancy tax because hotel and motel occupancy hasn't picked back up, and also parking citations and utility late fees, all of which were affected by the pandemic. Not all of the revenue sources in Long Beach's general fund move in the same direction at the same time, whether it's good times or bad. So when doing a revenue forecast for the entire general fund, I feel it's appropriate to make a reasonably expected estimate of every revenue because we will benefit from what, and I'm going to get a little technical, what economists call the law of large numbers. When you have a lot of wedges in the slice of your revenue pie, you can afford to be off on one or another because it's likely to be made up by other revenue sources. When they're all correlated and move the same way, you probably better be conservative in case things don't go well. But when you have a lot of different revenue sources and they counterbalance each other out over the long haul, you can safely make a reasonably expected revenue forecast rather than a reasonably conservative economic revenue forecast. So that's the reason for the proposed policy change, and that's how we intend to make the general fund revenue forecast in March. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Grace.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So continuing just general trends that we are seeing in our projections. So on the expenditure side, as mentioned before, we will be updating our baseline costs for doing the same level of service in January. This is to include step changes, skill pay assignments, overhead rates, benefit projection updates, pension cost updates. We'll also, during this time, be including the same assumption that we have for negotiated cost increases that we had before, which was for those agreements that have a contract in FY23, we will estimate the cost of those contracts. And if there is no contract or a new contract is being negotiated, we will include a general inflation factor as a placeholder. So no change there in those assumptions for our next update. There are several uncertainties and assumptions that we have that are important to point out. The first is that our projections will be assuming that there isn't another future recession. If there is, that would change the outlook, and we would have to adjust those projections at that time. Also, with regards to Measure M, we have just received news last week that the recent appellate court ruling is not favorable to the city. The city, however, does not agree with this ruling and will be petitioning to the Supreme Court for its review. Ultimately, if we are unsuccessful with the Supreme Court, there will be about a $9 million impact to the structural shortfall and about a $24 million or more of one-times that will need to be identified, depending on timing. On the other hand, if we are successful, there will be a windfall of some one-times that we will have available, no longer needed to be set aside per the litigation. For now, we'll be working to identify options for the $9 million or more that needs to be set aside starting in FY22, even if the Supreme Court takes up our case. We're currently evaluating the timing of potential outcomes and the impacts to the budget process, and additional information will be provided in the March 2022 update. Another uncertainty that we have are negotiations with our labor group. The current police, fire, and lifeguard MOUs will be expiring at the end of FY22, and so discussions for new contracts will be occurring concurrently with the FY23 budget development process. We will be discussing internally how to address timing factors, and we'll come back to City Council with any recommendations and updates. And lastly, the pandemic impacts are an unknown. The impacts of the pandemic may continue, and it's very difficult to project what those impacts will be given this rapidly changing situation. If the pandemic continues or worsens, we would also continue to seek external funding and support, and so that's something we would look to help mitigate any negative impact. As we're working to close out FY21 and update our FY23 budget projections, we will also be continuing to evaluate what budget balancing strategies are available for us to pursue. This may include, but are not limited to, exploring internal efficiencies, cost-saving opportunities, long-term financing if appropriate, looking to see if Measure A could provide additional support, looking at areas of cost recovery per our financial policy with our fees, working with bargaining groups to find savings. These are just a list of examples to potentially explore, and any option being researched and considered will be evaluated using an equity lens as well. We certainly have good news with the way revenues are performing, as Kevin talked about, and we will be pursuing as many offsets as we can that are viable prior to having to look at any service reductions. It is important to be cautious, however, that the magnitude of the starting shortfall was significant and may require some difficult decisions on cuts or impact to services. But we will know more in the March timeframe, and we will report back to City Council at that time. In terms of one-times in the budget process, we have two financial policies that guide how we handle one-times. Financial Policy 1 states that the budget will be structurally balanced, which means we don't want to spend more on ongoing services than what we have in ongoing revenue. So in other words, if my paycheck gives me $3,000 a month, I don't want to have regular bills that exceed $3,000 a month. Then Financial Policy 5 states that one-time resources will be used only for one-time purposes. The goal of this policy is to avoid a situation where we are depending on a short-term or one-time revenue source to pay for ongoing costs of operation. So for example, if I got a gift of $500 from my aunt one month, I don't want to sign up for a software subscription that costs me $500 each month. So while I may be able to pay for that subscription in the first month, in the second month, I no longer have that gift from my aunt to cover the ongoing costs moving forward. Similarly, if my regular bills are $3,000 a month, but my paycheck is only $2,500 a month, even if my aunt gave me a gift of $500 a month to help me pay for all my bills, in the next month, I'm going to have to find a more permanent solution to address my $500 gap, either by making more money or scaling back on my expenses. That gift from my aunt was really only a solution to help me in that first month. For the city in the past couple years, one-times have been strategically used during the peak of the pandemic and also as we look to recover as a city and community to help solve some of our structural shortfall. This was something that made sense and something we recommended. Moving forward, we should continue to be strategic and thoughtful and fiscally prudent on when and how one-times are used when it comes to balancing any structural shortfall. Some considerations include that when we use one-time monies to plug the gap in structural shortfalls, we are taking away from possibly using those one-times for projects or other important investments. One-times, however, can be an important and helpful strategic tool in implementing transitions, whether transitioning to needed service cuts or plugging the gap as part of a multi-year budget plan. All of these things are things that staff will be assessing and evaluating and will bring back recommendations to City Council as part of the proposed budget process. And lastly, building up our city's operating and emergency reserves should be considered an important priority use of any one-times we may have. The last item I'd like to cover is the city's plan to engage in early community engagement for the FY23 budget process. This year, for the first time, we will be engaging with the community early in the budget process prior to the proposed budget being developed, rather than starting the engagement in August with the release of the proposed budget. This responds to last year's request by Mayor and City Council for earlier community engagement and also supports the city's goals outlined in the Racial Reconciliation Framework. We are planning for 4 in-person community meetings in January, as well as a general survey to be made available. The comments and feedback from these efforts will then be synthesized and made available to council and city staff in March to take into consideration as the proposed budget is being developed. We will be engaging with the community prior to any materials being available or decisions being made on the proposed budget. But we will have the FY22 budget book available, as well as the service priority budgeting materials that describe every department's service area and potential levels of service delivery that are available as a resource for City Council and the community to help frame discussions on priorities. As we begin our budget process, we want to work to apply an equity lens throughout the process. Some of the ways that we are doing this is the early community engagement, as mentioned, with the goal of including more community voices from across the city, particularly those who are most impacted by racial inequities and systemic racism. We want to ensure that the budget process is accessible by including language access opportunities during meetings and by translating our materials. And in the decision-making process, we are looking to use an equity lens to evaluate budget proposals and the budget balancing strategies. So in conclusion, between now and February, staff will be working on the projection updates for FY23, as well as evaluating potential offset options. We'll be engaging with the community on budget priorities in January, and in March, we will provide the mayor and city council with projection updates, as well as a summary of community feedback. So this concludes our presentation on the FY23 budget process, and we are available for any questions.
Thank you very much. I want to just start with a couple comments and maybe a couple questions, and then if any of the council wants to queue up, please go ahead and do so as well. I think I know our budget chair wants to have some remarks, I think, and then we're going to anyone else that has any questions. A couple things. So first, to our new finance director, Mr. Riper, right? And I know that we haven't all worked together a lot yet, but we're going to be very soon. And wanted just to welcome you officially. I think, unless I miss it, I think this is your first council presentation. And so welcome. And I think it's also, an opportunity for you to hear directly from us about maybe some parts of the budget process that we, or the way the budget is prepared, that maybe we'd like to see some change. I think that this is an opportunity with like a fresh new set of eyes and a new director in place that I think that's a great opportunity for us to have some conversations. And I know you have already made a recommendation around what did you call it? The expected versus conservative language. I know that that's something that that you feel strongly about, and I appreciate that. And I think those are the types of kind of creative budget ideas that we want to hear about. I understand from Mr. Modica that you've already presented to him a bunch of new ways of looking at different parts of the budget, and I think that's really exciting. I don't know what those are yet, but I look forward to hearing about them when the budget process starts. And so I just want to encourage you to try new things. I think it's a good opportunity for us to do that. I want to just also add a few thoughts. The first, I want to go to slide 7, please. I just want to say broadly that there is no question that revenues are performing better. Whether you're looking at the state budget, the LA County budget, or other municipal budgets that I'm seeing across the state, the state as a whole is in a much stronger financial position, as is the country, in a relatively short period of time. Now, I know that we don't have an exact projection yet, and I won't ask you to make one tonight. But I'm assuming by seeing what the projection differences are particularly around sales tax that is happening up and down the state of California, we could see a pretty significant decrease of that of that deficit. And I see you're shaking your head. I think that's correct. And I know that we don't want to make any assumptions today, but when you're looking at sales tax and property tax and Measure A and sales tax especially, I think what I think this council should feel good about is I think it's safe to say, well, we don't know the number. It's safe to say that number is going to be lower, that the council's going to have to wrestle with. I mean, I think we can all agree that is going to happen, correct?
That's correct, Mayor.
And I think we can also agree that, while there's a range, it could be a significant decrease that we're going to see if we trend anything like the rest of the state and some of the other governments across California.
Also correct.
So I say that because I know we have some hard decisions to make this upcoming year regardless. But I'm really heartened to see that. And it's something I think that a lot of us were expecting was going to happen. So thank you for that. Also want to just note, and this is something again that I spoke with Mr. Gross about, and maybe there's a different way of doing this as we move forward. I understand that there are some categories that are performing worse, right, and others performing better. But certainly the better ones have more dollars in those pots, so it's obviously a lot. It's a different level of better, so it's overall better, I guess is the best way to say it. So I'm happy to see that. I wanted to just for the future, because this has always kind of been something I've never been able to change. But I think moving forward, just from like a language perspective, I just don't think any of us. I don't think any of us want to celebrate parking citations as they're getting worse or getting better for us. I think ideally, as a community, we don't want people to get parking citations. We want folks to, and I understand it's a revenue source, and it's a real revenue source for the city. But I think oftentimes we present parking citations or utility late fees when someone can't pay the bill as a positive for the city. And so if we can think about how those are presented and discussed, I think that's something that I'd like to see. I don't think anybody in here enjoys when a person that's low income can't pay the rent, or they get a parking citation because they can't move their car because they're at work, or whatever the reason is. So I just want to note that, and I had mentioned this before. So with that, I think Mr. Ripper, I think want to just reiterate, you have an amazing budget staff and team, which you already know. And I'm just very grateful to the team we have in place. And Mr. Modica, thank you for putting together a great budget team. And I think it's going to be a hard, but a good year for us as well. And so thank you for this presentation. I look forward to getting into the budget over the next few months. And let me turn this over to our budget chair, Councilman Austin.
Thank you, and I agree with everything that the mayor said. I want to thank staff for a very comprehensive overview of our budget in terms of outlook, where we're going. I'm very encouraged with the news of improving revenues. I think that's great news for the city, for our budget overall. And thank you for breaking down the categories and where the budget is actually improving with sales tax, property sales, and cannabis, which is not much of a surprise to us. I am surprised with the unemployment issues. I think that is a challenge that we as a council need to really take a deeper dive and understand why we're performing lower than the rest of the county in that category. I thought for certain that we addressed the budget kind of terminology and approach from reasonably conservative maybe a year or two ago, but I'm totally in support of reasonable expectations. However, I will say that I'm not sure that 2020 and 2021 we could have had reasonable expectations based on the uncertainty that we were facing, and so I certainly hope that we don't have that kind of volatility in the future moving forward. But I do think that is a reasonable approach to budgeting. Our Measure M, the news in terms of the The recent decision is obviously very concerning to me. When I saw that, the immediate thought was, dollars and cents, and how is this going to impact our next budget? I do think that early engagement is and I support that. I think it's important to our budget process. It may help smooth the process over, particularly with the community, if we're getting early engagement and impacts. But I do think it's important to even have contingencies in place and transparent discussions about how our budget could be impacted by the loss of those revenues from Measure M, but also potential shortfalls. And so I want to make sure that we're having those discussions early in the process, and so that there's no sticker shock or shock at the end for the community or for our city employees, for that matter. I think it's very, very important that we be prudent, transparent, and prepared as much as possible to discuss those issues during that early engagement process. My comments are going to be short here. I think the presentation speaks for itself. As a budget oversight committee, as a city council, we're going to have our work cut out for us in this next budget year, and I'm looking forward to engaging with the community on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Price.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you very much to our finance team for the presentation. It was a really good overview, and it's nice to see some of the trends going in a positive direction. I did have a question, and I'm sure all of us hear this from constituents from time to time, but the question of, do you know how much I pay in property taxes, followed by whatever the issue that is of concern of the day is. And so the question that I had is, I actually really don't know by district what the property tax breakdown is. And I also don't know by district what the sales tax breakdown is. Is that information that we can get in the form of a TFF or as a follow-up?
Yes, we can provide that information in a follow-up.
That's also important for us as we're thinking holistically about the city. What kinds of businesses are attracting the most customers in terms of our sales tax revenue? And how can we further attract those types of businesses to the city, since we know that they are popular with residents in the city and throughout the region? And then also, the areas where we're getting the highest property tax revenue, are we making sure that those areas are continuing to be desirable locations for future investment by people choosing to purchase real property? Since that is a major source of our revenue in the city of Long Beach, I think it's important for us to figure out where that property tax, where a lot of that property tax base is, and make sure that some of the basic needs of those residents are met there, because we're now competing with other similar property tax areas within the region, and they could be looking, just across the border of our city to another city that has similar cost property, but perhaps has different amenities, city services, and things of that nature. So we want to make sure that we stay competitive, not just from business standpoint, but also from where people to choose to invest financially in personal property. I think that's really important, knowing how big of a chunk of our revenue that is. So I would value that information. I think it would be helpful for me. But beyond that, I hope the trend continues to go upward. And I do like the change that we're making to expected, because I think we have had in the past, I've been on the Budget Oversight Committee for a number of years, and the initial presentation is also always a very scary presentation. The numbers are overly conservative at times, which I tend to like and feel safe with. But the ultimate numbers that we end up having as the discussion point are always vastly different from our initial numbers, because our actuaries are so different. So I really appreciate changing that. And hope that yields a more productive discussion as we're talking about the nuts and bolts of budgeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Mungo.
Thank you. to Councilmember Price's point, and we've discussed this now at the Economic Development Committee, I think the other thing that the budget book is lacking, and when I make my budget presentation, and now that staff is turning over, Mr. Gross won't get to hear my presentation for the 8th year in a row, but I pull the data from the county assessor's book on what percentage of property tax comes to the city of Long Beach. And so I think it's really important for people to know, because someone will call me and say, I pay $900 a year in property tax. That does not come to the city of Long Beach. And so what I think is really important is that in the front of our budget book, at a sliding scale of what you pay per year, people who bought their homes in 1954 for $24,000 or $54,000, their escalated price of what they pay annually is around the $900 range, and we have a lot of original owners still of those level of property. It's important to show, like, the county of the state takes this much. The city gets this much. And I think that's important to note, because the perception of the public is that all of that money comes to the city of Long Beach to provide the services they want. And then that asks the question, where's all the money go? But I don't think that they recognize that we have to then apply for it to come back to us through a state mechanism, through their budgeting process, and that the state puts other strings and priorities on some of that revenue. And I think that's a really good, valuable discussion to have, because I think that, like we're discussing at the Economic Development Committee, there may be a time where we think that the taxation structure of cities and states and counties within the region needs to change. The state shouldn't have a surplus every single year, and us cities struggle. Within that, the same is true of sales tax. And I'd like to see a page dedicated to the sales tax is 10.25%. And of that 10.25%, if you buy $1,000 worth of groceries in a year, let's figure out what the average person spends on groceries in a year, and then say the sales tax collected would be this much money. And so if you spend $100, it's $10.25. Of that $10.25, the city of Long Beach gets $2. And let's be honest about that and show where is the greatest bulk of sales tax coming from. We see that at the Economic Development Committee meeting, but we would be able to say, for the previous fiscal year, 32% of sales tax came from the 1 cent that comes off of gas. Because I don't think people know and understand that you pay, what is it right now, $6 a gallon for gas. How much does the city of Long Beach get? Is it 48 cents? Is it $1.50? And with that, if it is $1.50, how much of it comes because the city decides and we get 48 cents? And then the other dollar comes because we apply for Measure R. Give me some other letters. Tom and I were discussing these letters. Measure R.
Measure R, Measure M,
Measure C.
Measure Prop A, Prop C.
Prop C, thank you. There is an H somewhere, but H is public safety. So each of these different things, they don't tie to things. When people read the budget book, they're like, oh, Councilwoman Mungo, when she was the chair of budget oversight, created heart teams, but it was out of Measure H funds, and then that went down. But no one knows, like, Measure H funds were approved in this year for this purpose by this body of voters. And to change it, this is what it would take. What are those requirements? And so over time, every year, we've kind of grown our budget book and that information, and a lot of it's static. I think these 2 pages would be pretty valuable. The property tax, the sales tax, and the gas tax, and how it flows back into the city. And then finally, I know I've had this discussion with a lot of people. The budget comes pretty much baked by the time it gets to the council. I really appreciate that you're going to do the community meetings in advance of putting together the budget. But I think you also need to meet with the council members in advance of doing the budget. Just because certain council members spend more time on agenda items, bringing items to council to explore funding for this or explore funding for that, it doesn't mean that other council members don't have those same desires or goals. My office receives 12,000 calls for service a year. Some offices receive under 100. Some offices receive 800. And so my office doesn't spend as much time bringing agenda items, but I would love to see funding put into a park master plan. And I've talked about it with Brent Dennis, and he's going to put it in his budget, and it's going to come from the Parks and Rec side. Council members work differently. Some of us work with department heads to ask them to put it into their plan. And then when they present it to the city manager and it doesn't get approved, I'm like, well, darn, I should have brought it to the full council, voted for 9, and then the city manager would have had to put it in there. there's just there's like 7 different paths to make it into the budget. And I'd like to see that, I don't know, diversified and legitimized. So those are some of my asks. And I think that we as a city do an excellent job. Many know that I've taught budget and finance to guest lecture at many different colleges and universities. I love referencing Long Beach. I love what we're doing. And I think that we could be a one-stop shop instead of a council member needing to pull the assessor's book, pull the auditor controller's book, pull all these different resources for people to know and understand how much. Because each city in LA County negotiated a different percentage of property tax. So when they hear from their friend, this is how much your city's getting, that's not accurate. And they need to know for Long Beach. And I think the other thing that people don't always know is I bought my house in 2008. My neighbor bought his house in 2020. We don't pay the same amount of property tax. And that's an important component too. So we need to direct them a little picture, like here's your property tax statement. Here's how much is paid here, there, and the other, a little picture, because then people will know and understand. And I've had those talks over and over again, and people are really impressed and surprised that they're protected by Prop 13. They don't realize that. Some people think that only if this happened or only if that. And they also don't realize that Prop 19 is changing a lot of that and potentially increasing property tax revenue for the city. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I wish I had ever paid a $900 property tax. That would be amazing.
Lots of people in my district.
I know
Lots.
a lot of people pay $900 property taxes.
Of which I think at the time Mr. Gross said that we got $134.
No, I know. It's incredible. Just daydreaming about it.
But I do think that person also should be recognized because they've paid that $900 for 65 years. So they've invested in years where they didn't use any city services, and they've kind of prepaid for the services they use more of as they have aged.
Mr. Mayor, just to give the real simple answer, we get in our city about 21% of the property tax goes to Long Beach, 28% goes to the county, and about 50% of it goes to the school districts and the state for the schools. It gets more complicated than that. We can talk about that later, and there's actually more that goes to those agencies than us, but we roughly get 21%.
Thank you. Councilman Supernal.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up with staff on a question that Councilwoman Price had about a 2 from 4 on sales tax. In the past, I've been told, not necessarily by your department, that there's a lag, that we wouldn't get that information instantaneously. Do you know how long that is? Is it 90 days or 120 days, or where are we with that?
So when we usually get the information, it's about, I would say 3 months. You could think about it as a 3-month. We do get data, we do get revenue every month, but those are based on estimates, and then there's a true up. So there is that lag in terms of when we know what the actual performance would be, even though we get some revenue that comes in. It's not something that's exactly the actual performance until the true up month.
Okay, so if I wanted to get the data on a particular restaurant or retail establishment, it would be at least 90 days, and then maybe more accurate after that point? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, there's a lag, but there also are some parameters and some privacy information in terms of what sales tax is available. We don't provide it on businesses because that would have some other consequences. We have provided information in geo regions and areas like that. So that's something we can look into in providing more information to council, but not specific businesses.
Okay, so if we had, for example, if I want to know how the restaurants in the traffic circle area are doing, would you be able to get, was that too refined, or would you be able to deliver that information?
We'd have to check the geo areas. I think that might be too specific. We have set geo areas that are approved and allowed to be shared. There are certain categories of sales tax that can also be reported in those broad categories, but beyond that, if it gets more granular to like specific types of businesses within those broader categories, we wouldn't be able to provide that information.
Okay. A few years back, well, we used to have a list like the top 10 employers in the city, and at one point, and this goes back a lot of years, I recall the top 10 sales tax generators in the cities. So you're saying now that that's too specific at this point?
It's okay for us to list the top 25 sales tax payers in alphabetical order without dollar amounts.
Okay.
That's as far as the state allows us to go because of confidential taxpayer information.
Understood. Okay, well, thank you. I'd sure like to be on that 2 from 4 when that's generated. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councilwoman Sorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate it and echo with my colleagues. They made some good points, especially with the mayor around how do we better term penalty fees as something not necessarily we're dependent on. I want to go to page 9 where it talks about, well, I know that we want to focus a lot about overall revenue trends improving. I also want to make sure we don't skim out on expense trends because I can't tell from this if this is really taking into the inflation rate that we've been seeing, and I don't know how the trend's going to keep moving in that direction next year. So I'd love to see if we can have a little more information about the impacts of that. Like, I don't know, will all of the costs of our facilities cost more money because of inflation rates in other areas, right? So I can't tell the impact. And if our deficit of $36 million will still be the same, or if it'll be higher because of that. And if our budget is projected to, our revenue may increase, I'm not sure if our expense will increase, right? So then it might even out. So that's where I'd love a little more information so that we have a clearer picture in addition to the uncertainties that may come up.
Certainly, we can definitely provide that information. That is something we are looking to provide more detail in the March projection when we have all of our projections actually finalized. You are absolutely correct that the emphasis has been on revenue, but there is the other side of the coin, which is the expenditure trends. In general, during the base projection time, in the past, expenditure trends have been increasing at a higher cost than revenue, which is what drives the shortfall situation. But we are going to, from our past projection, are anticipating improvements from the revenue side, and we're going to need to be evaluating the expenditure side. I will say the past projections that we had for the 36 million also factored in growth on the expenditure side. So in this case, it would be just looking to see, are there incremental differences in the growth that we had already previously assumed? Also, there are those variables like Measure M that we have to see what is the outcome of that. But those are all things that we will bring back in greater detail in March.
Okay, I think maybe it was just more of a breakdown of where that 36 million deficit is coming from. That kind of helps answer my question that it does include the projected expense of inflation, and I just forgot. So perhaps having a reminder of where that number came from would be helpful whenever we do a presentation.
Thank you. I see no other council comment. So let me just go ahead and conclude by just adding one more thing. I have a motion and a second to approve it. I don't believe there's any public comment, Mr. Clerk, on this.
No public comment.
Okay, let me just one last thing. I think overall, just want to be grateful that we're going to be seeing that our budget is improving, and certainly that we'll be seeing a revised number here early next year. And I think we all hope that it is going as well for us as it's going for the state and other places. But we'll see. I know that there's a lot of factors there. And I also want to just add from a request perspective also, I think it's important, and this kind of sparked when Councilman Mungo and Councilman Price were talking about different measures and letters. I do think it's really important that we also quantify the impact of voter-approved measures. And the reason why I think it's important, not just ones that are local at the city, but also county ones. Because I think, prior to when this council put Measure A on the ballot, the city hadn't passed a municipal tax in 40, 50 years. Since that measure has been adopted, I think it's important for the community to see in the budget book what their vote actually has meant in total, not just for the year. And that goes for other measures that the community may have voted on. Let's take measure the county the transit tax, or the homelessness Measure H, or other measures that are revenue related, like Measure B, that puts money aside into an account. I think it would be nice, certainly, to understand what the actual yearly impact is, but I'd like to see a page in the budget book that speaks to the total impact since voters approved that measure. And we can go as far back as, well, it can only be 10 because prior to that, we had decades of no new revenue, of measures at least at the local city level. So if we can see something like that, Mr. Modica and Mr. Riper, I'd like to see that in some form in the budget presentation. And especially because in the future, I think it's important for future councils and for the public to see what their action has actually brought to the community. Which is very different than other types of revenue, I think, right? So, well, thank you. With that, we have a motion and a second to receive and file. Please cast your votes.
Councilwoman Zunez. Are you a yes? Motion carries.
Well, thank you. And now we are on break until our meeting that starts at 5 o'clock. Thank you.
No closed session.
Oh, I'm sorry. We do have a closed session at what time, Mr. Parkin? We don't.
No closed session, we have Housing
Okay, but
Authority.
there's a housing authority meeting, maybe?
4:45.
At 4:45. Okay, thank you.
Just now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll check it out.